We are back, and we are joined now by Sandeep Vaheesan, legal director at the Open Markets Institute, working on anti-monopoly and antitrust issues, author of Democracy and Power, A History of Electrification in the United States. Sandeep, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So obviously, I felt like we have to start here. We opened the show talking about the devastation of the Los Angeles fires. But if you could just, as somebody who in this book researched our public utilities and their history and how we can move forward in decarbonizing our utilities, what was your reaction to what we're seeing out of California right now?
It's horrifying, of course. We're seeing wildfires threaten the nation's second largest city, burning down thousands of acres. And it just underscores that the climate crisis is real, it's not theoretical, and that we need to take aggressive action to stem further harm. And, we've made progress. There's certainly more renewable energy on the grid than ever, but we still rely heavily on fossil fuels. More than 60% of our electricity comes from either coal or natural gas. So what we've done so far is not enough. And we really need to step up our game. And simply continuing down this present trajectory means we're going to see more incidents like the scenes we're seeing out of Los Angeles.
Right, and the progress that you mention, a lot of it is more kind of like technocratic. There were a lot of good things that the Biden administration did in terms of their efforts to make sure move the ball forward in terms of changing our energy system to be a little bit greener. But
Right.
What your book really does focus on is the idea of a public ownership vision. Can
Right.
you contrast that vision with the more technocratic vision, and like where those gaps are between even what the Democrats propose and want on a federal level, and what would probably make us most resilient and transition us more quickly?
Yeah, so at the outset, I should state that about 1 in 4 power customers in the United States gets their electricity from a publicly owned or cooperative utility. So I mentioned that fact because people might say, well, public ownership is utopian, it's foreign, it's not something we do with the United States, but we're already doing it on a very large scale. And right now, the present approach among the Democratic Party, probably best exemplified in the Inflation Reduction Act, is we should throw subsidies at the private sector, principally in the form of tax credits, and encourage them to invest more in renewable and other forms of clean energy. And that's what we've been doing for a long time. And my book says, well, if we're going to spend all this money, we should have more control over how it's spent. Instead of throwing carrots at the private sector, why don't we directly invest ourselves in clean energy and upgrades to the grid? And that's something that was done on a very large scale by President Franklin D. Roosevelt during the New Deal. The New Dealers spent a lot of money and invested directly to bring, among other things, light and power to the countryside. I think the basic thesis of my book is we already have this model. It's not perfect, but why don't we expand and perfect that and use the public sector to lead the fight against climate change instead of relying on these subsidies, which in some cases, we've made some progress, as I said, but I do fear that the end result could be we have more billionaires in this country rather than a clean energy grid.
Right, and the subsidies also in terms of long-term growth. Part of the problem is that oil and gas, you can keep drilling for it, and the price of a gallon it's going to fluctuate, obviously, but
Right.
it's a tangible resource, fuel, that you need to refill up your gas tank. You need to reuse more of this tangible resource that can be you can charge it by the gallon, et cetera, as opposed to solar panels where the profit margins for companies that may be installing them, these for-profit companies, without government subsidy, they're less incentivized to go into that business just because
Right.
they can't make as much money as they could with other energy sources. So like there's that incompatibility when we begin the conversation, in addition to all of the other reasons that you describe.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the private sector is going to invest based on profit considerations. So if fossil fuels continue to be profitable, they'll plow more money into oil and gas exploration and production. If renewables are more profitable, they'll go there. But it's very risky, in my view, to rely solely on the profit motive and say, well, we're throwing more subsidies at green energy. Let's hope 5 years down the road we have more wind and solar. I think it's very risky. I think it's very fraught. Why don't we invest directly, not abandon the profit motive, but maybe make it secondary and recognize the climate crisis is urgent. We need to invest regardless of whether it's profitable for Wall Street. And I think you're right. So if we rely purely on the profit motive and more subsidies, we're not going to get the investment we need to decarbonize. Certainly not on the time frame we need.
And there's a really fascinating, historical parallel that you explore in your book, where about the expansion of electric power at the beginning of the 20th century. So, can you start there? How the electrification process began, really, in the first 3 decades, setting up how FDR addressed it in a very different manner.
Right. So the power sector was dominated by private power companies for its first 4 or 5 decades, and they extended service based on profit considerations. And they viewed cities as profitable to serve. Lots of people are living in a relatively small area. If you build a mile of line, you might serve 300 or 400 customers. People are ready to use power on a large scale. By contrast, they looked at the countryside and said, population density is very low. We're going to build a mile of line and serve maybe 2 or 3 farms. And these farmers, we think of them as culturally, economically backward. They're not actually going to use all that much electricity. So through the 1920s, you saw the private power sector focusing heavily on cities, especially large industrial customers, using a lot of electricity and neglecting the countryside. So in 1930, only about 1 in 10 farmers had electricity. And this was a time when the United States was much more rural. Today, about 85% of people live in cities. Back then, it was almost 50-50. So you had tens of millions of people in the countryside without electricity. And the private sector is basically writing off all these people, saying they're not profitable to serve. We'll get to it when the economic logic makes sense. And so Roosevelt comes in and says, what we're going to do is recognize first that electricity is a necessity. It's no longer a luxury. And that the only way to actually extend power lines into the countryside is by directly investing. And so what the New Deal did was the New Dealers created an agency called the Rural Electrification Administration that extended low-cost credit to rural electric cooperatives, which are community-owned institutions. And they built power lines into the countryside on a not-for-profit basis. And it was an extraordinarily successful program. So as I mentioned, in the 30s, about 1 in 10 farmers had electricity. 20 years later, that number was more than 9 in 10. So it utterly transformed life in the countryside. The practical benefits of electricity are you no longer rely on candles and kerosene lamps. You no longer have to do your laundry by hand. You have indoor plumbing. You have washing machines. Life became radically different and better in the countryside. So it wasn't just a matter of spending. It was a matter of spending to make people's living standards significantly higher.
And the what I was very unaware of was the corporate propaganda that was being deployed, and it was so eerily reminiscent of what oil and gas does today. But basically to downplay the idea of making this more publicly owned and expanding in ways that would not be profitable for them, but were obviously immensely beneficial for society, as you just say. That huge shift in just 2 decades in terms of electrification. What were some of the tactics that these private companies used to stave off public control?
They really pulled out all the stops to suppress the growth of public and cooperative ownership. So among the interesting things they did was they would actually review elementary school, high school, college textbooks and rewrite them. They would say, well, this presents public ownership in an unduly sympathetic light. It's too critical of private ownership. We're going to pull these textbooks and supply more industry-friendly textbooks. And, they had a lot of money to donate. They supported institutions of higher education. So they had a lot of leverage. So they effectively rewrote curricula to present themselves in a favorable light. So that was one thing they did. They trained people, including their own staff, to go out and give speeches touting the virtues of private power, saying public power is socialistic, it's Bolshevism. This was just a few years after the Russian Revolution, so they engaged in classic red baiting. And then another thing they did was they basically produced stories and editorial commentary and gave them to newspapers for free and said, hey, run this content and we'll buy a lot of ads in your paper. So it really was a systematic campaign to prop up private power and say that any alternatives are suspect and bad.
And how did FDR garner the political capital and will to take that on?
So the crash of 29 and the Great Depression really opened up new political possibilities. In a sense, laissez-faire capitalism was discredited. Millions of people were thrown out of work. And so there was a desire for alternatives. And I think FDR was smart and recognized, okay, here's an opening. Events don't automatically translate into different political economies, but he recognized, okay, the corporate barons stand tainted in the eyes of the public. Let me use this as an opportunity to present alternatives, more democratic alternatives. And one thing that he did extraordinarily well was he recognized as the president that he not only made policy and fought for good policy, but that he was, in a sense, the nation's lead political educator. So while private power fought all the things he tried to do, whether it was set up the Tennessee Valley Authority or support rural electrification, he used his bully pulpit to say, we actually can do things differently. We can invest directly. We can make life better for everyone. And that's something we don't really expect from presidents and politicians today, but it was really instrumental in winning many of these fights. And these fights are very, very challenging. It's easy to overstate how easy some of these fights were, but they were extraordinarily hard. And figures like Joe Manchin are hardly new.
Right. Well, I mean, in terms of using the bully pulpit, Donald Trump does that. Donald Trump does that a lot. I wish the Democrats would, but we also had a president who seemed kind of incapable of literally using the bully pulpit in any real way to sell this kind of thing. And it still is the technocratic stuff that you described, like tax credits. This is for people making over $100,000 a year, right? And then also, again, for this investment class. And there is this notion that private ownership of these things fosters innovation, right? And that is a refrain that is deployed by both parties in this country.
Absolutely.
But the history that you're describing says the opposite, that it was the public ownership or like the incentive with these cooperatives, at least in terms of the expansion, that perhaps it wasn't innovation, but it did improve our society in a really rapid way. And that was public investment, not private.
Yeah, you're right. It's an article of faith today that the private sector is dynamic and innovative and the public sector is the exact opposite. And if you look at the New Deal, it was really the public sector that was leading. So here's a concrete example. I mentioned earlier that private power said that rural areas are too expensive to serve. And so one fact they often mentioned was building a mile of distribution line in the countryside would cost anywhere from $1,500 to $2,000. And staff at the Rural Electrification Administration looked into that and said, actually, it doesn't need to be that high. What if we standardized and simplified line designs, spread apart the poles, removed some of the extraneous flourishes on them? We could actually do this for a lot less. And so within a few years, the REA concluded that actually a mile of power line in the countryside could be built for as little as $450. So this is an example of the public sector innovating. And further, the public sector quickly determined that there is actually a lot of use for electricity in farms, in rural homes that the private sector had just neglected. They recognized, okay, there's tremendous opportunity to electrify farm operations and sell a lot of power to rural Americans. And so the public sector led, and eventually the private sector came around and realized, okay, we could actually make money building lines into rural America. And so they did, but they were very much the laggards in this effort.
And in terms of how after these gains were made, what happened to kind of I guess loosen public control of our power system in the, I guess, latter part of the 20th century?
Yeah, so there was an effort starting in the late 1970s to deregulate, or I think my preferred term is restructure a number of industries. People know about airline deregulation, banking deregulation, trucking deregulation, but there was a similar effort undertaken in the power sector. And what really happened was there was a weakening of public control over these private utilities. There was a view that public regulation was hopeless, that the regulators would be captured. They were always a step or two behind the regulated companies. And so starting in the 70s, Congress as well as state government said, let's just try to create markets for electricity. We've tried regulation for about 75 years now. Let's use markets to sell and distribute power. And so we've had this sort of strange system, and this hasn't happened nationwide. It's mainly in the Northeast, California, and parts of the Midwest, where we have electricity markets where electricity is sold every 10 minutes. Utilities serving customers say, well, we need 500 megawatts of power, and then generators say, okay, we will supply 500 megawatts of power for a certain price. And we've had markets, and these markets have frankly not been all that effective. We've seen a lot of turbulence. We had a major power crisis in California about 25 years ago, more recently in Texas in 2021. And the practical problem is the prices keep yo-yoing. At times they're way too high, people struggle to pay their power bills. And at other times, maybe surprising to some people, they're actually too low. Power prices are so low that these generators cannot actually make money on the plants that they own, which is a serious problem because they have debts to service. And that's really what happened in Texas in 2021. When Winter Storm Uri hit, it turned out that Texas didn't have enough margins to meet the spike in power demand. All the necessary plants had been retired over the past 15 years because they were no longer profitable.
Can you talk a little bit more about Texas's power grid, which has presented numerous problems in recent years? And specifically, if you could compare it to right now, New York, our state, has this public renewables effort that they're pushing. Very contrasting visions, and just like what this looks like practically in 2025.
Yeah, so Texas in many ways is an exemplar of the libertarian approach to power policy. So they've completely deregulated the market. Every resident of Texas has to choose a competitive supplier, figure out like who's going to offer the best deal. There's been a lot of misconduct and fraud in that retail power market, probably not surprising. And then upstream at the generation level, they have these competitive markets that have produced insufficient reserves, as residents of the state found out in 2021. And one peculiarity of Texas that I should mention is the Texas grid is actually isolated from the other two grids in the United States. So they're, in a sense, cut off from the Western grid and the Eastern grid. So when there's a spike in demand in the state, they can't actually pull power from Louisiana. And the reason they did this was the power companies in Texas didn't want to be regulated by the federal government back in the 1930s. So very nice deal for them, but not so good for ordinary Texans. New York is a contrast in some ways. You're right. In 2023, the legislature gave the publicly owned New York Power Authority the power to build large-scale renewable energy. So in New York, we're seeing a real push to make the public sector the lead actor in decarbonizing the state's grid. And recently, the Power Authority proposed to build 3.5 gigawatts of clean energy over the next, I believe, 5 years. People are saying they should be doing a lot more, but there's an ongoing fight to make the public sector be the lead actor in cleaning up New York's power supply, which is very, very different from the Texas approach, which is we'll trust the private sector and hope that the profit motive leads them to do the right thing for us.
And in terms of more rural areas to states that perhaps are a little bit less populous, is that, in maybe in the middle of the country, southern states, is that where you see some of the worst abuses because there's probably less oversight?
Yeah, so many of the areas you're talking about are served by rural electric cooperatives, which were once very small d democratic institutions controlled by their communities, accountable to their communities. And what we've seen over the past 30 or 40 years is many of these entities have become extremely insulated from their public. They've become defined by self-perpetuating boards, board members that serve for 30, 40 years without ever facing electoral challenges. We've seen outright corruption. And many of these institutions that were once quite progressive have become very conservative in really every sense of the word. They've resisted climate change regulation. They've even challenged the basic science of climate change. But the one good thing is these cooperatives, no matter how dysfunctional they are still democratic on paper. And we've actually seen member revolts in several cooperatives in Texas and South Carolina, where people said, enough is enough. Our cooperative CEO shouldn't be paying himself $1 million a year. This is an institution that belongs to us. We want them to take climate change seriously. So even at the worst cooperatives, when things get bad enough, we have seen people rise up and say, we're going to retake these institutions and run it for our collective again.
Sandeep Vaheesan, the book is called Democracy and Power, A History of Electrification in the United States. Thanks so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. It was a lot of fun.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.